And now we're going to get started with listing an asset for asset, or a trade request. So we're going to go to our contract, create a new ABI method, and we'll call it def post trade request. And again, this is asset for asset, so you're listing an asset, singular, and you're requesting an asset in return, also singular, quantity of 1, both ways. So we're going to state the asset to list will be an asset transfer transaction. And then the asset we want will be an asset argument. And then we want them to pay that box fee MBR payment. And this will be a payment transaction. And here we'll just return a string for now. We have a good understanding of how to return tuples if you'd like to do that. So this can pretty much be the same as the post listing request. And we'll just copy all this code here. Bring it down here. And the only difference is that the box fee MBR payment will now be slightly larger because the trade listing value, opposed to the listing value, where we just trade asset for algo, will require a fulfilled value, which is an extra byte. So we can just add 400 to this one for the extra byte, because a Boolean is just 1 byte. And now we get 25,300. So we're going to change this 24,900 to 25,300. And we're still going to increment the value. And we're still going to assert that the asset receiver is the contract address and the asset amount is 1. The listing name, box info, will be the same, lister and counter. The box reference will be the same. We'll still assert that the box doesn't exist, although it should never exist. When we create the listing box, it will now be 17 bytes. And for the listing value info, we're going to add, instead of the algo amount requested, we're going to state the asset requested. Or asset request .id. And this will need to be wrapped as an arc4 uint64. And then the fulfilled will be a Boolean, which will be initially set to false. And then we can place the bytes into the box, as we already did, and return string trade request posted. And we can test this out. Or we can actually also write the fulfill trade request and cancel request at the same time. And we can just copy this code here. We're just going to return a string this time. ABI method, def fulfill trade request. And for the fulfilled trade request, we're going to change a few of the arguments. If you wanted to, you could pass in the opt-in transaction as an argument, or you can keep it separate. So before a user fulfills a trade request, you can check if they're opted in. And if they're not, you could add an opt-in transaction to the group. But this way, you don't have to force them to opt in if they're already opted in, because then they would have to opt out just to make the method work. We're not going to include the asset opt-in argument here, but we're going to change a few of these arguments. So we're still going to pass in self. We're going to return a string instead of a tuple. And we're going to pass in the asset trade fulfillment, which will be an asset transfer. And we're also going to add the asset transfer fee, which is just going to be 1,000 microalgo. And this is to send the asset that the purchaser is buying with their asset immediately upon fulfilling the trade request. So it will only be 1,000 microalgo. And then we're going to ask them to confirm the asset listed. And then we're going to ask them to pass in the listing name. So we're going to change this to asserts asset transfer fee amounts is 1,000. And then we're also going to assert that the asset trade fulfillment dot asset amount is equal to 1, because this is asset for asset, 1 for 1. And then we can proceed as usual by defining the listing box, asserting it exists. And then for the listing value, it's not going to be a listing value class. It's going to be a trade listing value class. So we're going to state here, trade listing value dot from bytes value. And now we're going to have access. Instead of the algo requested, we're going to check the asset requested. And we're going to make sure that this matches the asset trade fulfillment dot acts for asset dot ID. So the asset being transferred to fulfill the trade request must match the asset requested in the listing request. And then instead of sending a payment to the lister, we're just going to state that after transferring the asset listed to the purchaser, we're going to change the listing value dots fulfilled to a Boolean of true. And then we're going to put into the listing box this new listing value as bytes. So when we take in the listing value, the trade listing value initially, the Boolean value is false, and we're setting it to true. And what this means is the asset that the user requested is now with the contract, and it will be able to send that asset to the lister since it's now fulfilled. And we're going to have to create a new method for the lister to now claim the asset that they requested. And the reason we do it separately is because there's a chance that the lister is not opted in to the asset that they're requesting. So we need to account for this and create a separate method in case that's true. Otherwise, this transaction will fail every time because the lister is not opted in if we include the asset transfer inner transaction into the fulfill trade request for the lister to receive their asset. For this new method, we're going to call it claim fulfilled trade request, pass in self, and then we're going to have the lister pay the transfer fee to receive the asset they requested. We're going to have them manually indicate the asset that they're expecting in return and the listing for this asset they requested. We're going to return a string here. And the first thing we need to do is assert that the lister for this listing is equal to the transaction.sender. And the lister is going to be an address type. So we need to convert this transaction.sender to an address type because it's currently an account type, as we saw earlier. And we're going to assert that the asset transfer fee dot amount is equal to 1,000 microalgo. Listing box. We're going to create a box reference. The key is the listing name as bytes. Value exists is equal to listing box dot maybe. Assert that this box exists. Listing value is equal to trade listing value dot from bytes, the value of the box. We're going to assert that the asset requested dot ID is equal to the listing value asset requested. And we're going to assert that the listing value dot fulfilled is equal to a boolean of true. And if all of these conditions pass, we can start the asset transfer for the lister to receive the asset they requested for this listing and delete the box afterwards. So transfer asset is going to be the asset requested dot ID. The asset receiver will be the sender of this transaction. The asset amount will be 1. And the fee will be the global minimum transaction fee. We submit this. We delete the box. And we return a string. Trade request fulfilled. And over here, we also need to return a string. And we'll actually reverse this. So we'll make this trade request fulfilled and trade request completed, because they're actually receiving the asset here. And now let's also create a cancel method. Def cancel trade request, pass in self, have them indicate the listed asset as an asset type, the listing name as a listing name instance. And then we want them to pay the transfer fee to send the asset back to them that they originally listed. And we'll return a string. Trade request canceled. And we'll assert that the transfer fee dot amount is equal to 1,000. We'll assert that the listing name dot lister is the current sender as an address type, transaction dot sender. We'll get the listing box, listing name dot bytes. Value exists is equal to listing box dot maybe. Assert that it exists. And then we're going to create the listing value. So trade listing value dot from bytes, the value of the box in bytes. Assert that the listing value dot asset listed is equal to the listed asset that they're expecting to be removed. And then we can start the asset transfer. The transfer asset will be the listed asset dot ID. The asset amount will be 1. The receiver will be the sender for this listing. And the fee will be the global dot minimum transaction fee. I'm going to submit this and delete the box and return the string we already did down here. And now we can test this out. So let's compile, make sure we don't get any errors. And we should have saved first, but I think I did already. And we have an error here for listing value line 188. And 188, for the trade request, we need to use the trade request listing value. So trade listing value. And what's cool is that in Puya, it kind of just knows that the original listing value class wouldn't work with this amounts of arguments. The listing value, the original one, wouldn't work when we pass in 3 values. It automatically kind of just checks how many bytes you're using and will give you this error, which is just amazing. So let's save, compile, or we can just press the up arrow in our terminal. And then we're going to launch this contract once it's done compiling. Go to our .env, place the new app ID in here. And we'll start writing our listen asset. We'll rename this number 5, asset for asset listing. And in our post trade request, we're going to need 3 arguments. So what we can change here is in the algo amount requested, we're going to change this to asset request, as we have here. And everything else pretty much stays the same. And then let's say that they want asset 2, as we have here in our .env. And we can place this instead of this one algo, we want asset 2. And this will need to be an integer. And we need to change the name of the method from post listing request to post trade request. And let's see how this runs. And we also need to change the algo amount requested, since we changed that to 25,300. And you can see here in the error, it tells us the assert failed for an integer of 25,300, as we have here. And now we should be good. We can start writing the code for fulfill listing request. And we're going to change this to number 6, fulfill trade request. And we're going to need an opt-in, which we already have here, for asset 1. And the fee payment will only be for 1,000 microalgo, since they're only paying for their transfer for asset 1 to the purchaser. And we're no longer submitting a payment transaction to purchase the asset. We're going to submit a asset transfer transaction. And we're going to need these variables here. And we're going to change the index to asset 2, which we can import right here. And the amount must be 1. Counter will be 1. And the ABI method is now going to be fulfill trade request. And as for the arguments, we can just copy this here to make things easier. So you can see the differences. So asset trade fulfillment will be the first argument. And this is going to be our asset transfer payment, where we send the asset that the lister is requesting. The second one will be the asset transfer fee. And we'll just grab this here, wrapped fee payment. There will be no asset payment in Algo. The third argument will be the asset listed, which is asset 1, which we already have here. And the listing name, we're going to keep that the same. We won't need the foreign account this time because we won't be transferring anything to the lister, since we have a fulfill trade request, and then we also have a claim trade request. And the fulfill trade request only submits the listed asset to our purchaser and has no interaction with the original lister in terms of transactions. You can remove this here and try running this. So they're going to opt in to asset 1, and our account is now opted into asset 1 already. But if we were starting fresh, you would include this. I won't here. But this basically added the opt-in transaction into the group. And we have here, sender is missing an S here when we copied and pasted. And asset 724395175 missing. And I believe this means that we need to have the contract opt into asset number 2 before it receives it. So we're going to add our trigger opt-in method and this fee payment into our fulfill trade request, which we'll add right here. And we're going to ask that it opts into asset 2 so that we can send it there. And fee payment transaction, this is fine. We'll say opt-in fee payment transaction. And wrapped opt-in payment. And then there's one small detail that I got wrong here. So when we created an asset, the asset number 2 obviously needs to be created by the buyer. Otherwise, they won't have the asset to send. And we're going to create test asset 2 and run this code. Because the buyer cannot send an asset that they don't have. And then we're going to create a second trade request, asset for asset listing. And we'll have a unique box here for this new listing. And this time they're requesting this new asset 2. And when we fulfill the trade request, now our buyer has an asset to actually pay with. And over here, the asset payment transaction needs to go to the app address. This was originally an opt-in transaction. When we run this, we get an assert failed. And this is because we're now working with the second listing, since we already had a listing here. But basically, the asset number 2 did not match with the asset requested originally. And we'll see here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 transactions. And this will be the payment for the opt-in, the opt-in method for the contract, the asset payment transaction, the fee payment to submit the listed asset to the buyer, and then the method for fulfilling the trade request. And now we're going to create a complete trade request, number 7. And let me just remove copy here. And in the complete trade request, we're not going to need all of this code here. We won't need to opt the contract in. We will need to opt into the asset that we're going to receive, which is asset 1 or asset 2. This will be a 0 amount. And the receiver will be ourselves, since we're opting into asset 2. Asset 2 opt-in transaction. And wrapped opt-in transaction. Then the fee payment for the contract to send us the asset. And we're going to be working with the lister address now. So we'll change this to private key from buyer private key. And we could have just used this here, which we actually will. So we'll remove this. And use asset 2. And now we're going to change details about the application call. So we're going to claim the fulfilled request. And the arguments here are an asset transfer fee, which we have here. And we're going to place this in here. The next one will be the asset requested. So we want them to manually indicate the asset that they're requesting. And then we're going to need the listing name. And I believe everything else should be good. Let's run this. Assert failed. So the box name was not retrieved. And that's because over here, we delete the listing once the buyer fulfills their end, but we don't give the lister a chance to come in and claim. So we're going to remove that, recompile. Oh. Create a new asset for asset listing once we launch the contract. Place in our new app ID. Create an asset for asset listing. Then fulfill the trade request. It will be counter number 1, since this is the first listing. And then we can complete the trade request, and this time the box will still be present. Change counter to number 1. And we're good. And we can take this ID for the fulfillment or completion of the trade request. And you see that we have the opt-in of the lister into the asset they requested, the payment for the asset transfer fee for the application to send the asset to the lister. And we're going to do 2 more types. And we're going to speed through this a little bit since I feel like you're getting the hang of this.